Okay, I think we are live now. Um, so, welcome everyone to another live event of Jeune Europe. Before we start, let me make a real brief introduction of Jeune Europe. So, Jeune Europe is a community of international individuals who share knowledge in their respective fields of expertise on a voluntary basis. So we are not affiliated to any political party, and we don't receive money from anyone really. Um, and now a bit of background of the live of tonight. So for the International Women's Day, I decided to write an article trying to assess the situation of the employment gender gap in the 6 major countries in the European Union. And doing my background research, I came across the work of our guest tonight, who has some very specific ideas on what could be done to tackle it, and who is also in a key position to steer direction, to foster change. So without any further ado, I welcome very much Alexandra Geese. Thank you very much for being here. We really appreciate it. Ms. Geese is a member of the European Parliament since the 2019 European elections with the Greens and the European Free Alliance Party. She has been serving the Committee on the Internal Market and the Consumer Protection. And since 2020, she has also joined the Special Committee on Artificial Intelligence in a Digital Age. So, Ms. Geese, let me start with a really general question. What is the gender employment gap? And also, the follow-up question will be, why is it still there in the European Union beacon of human rights, equality in the 21st century?
Well, thank you. Good evening to everybody. Hello, and thank you very much for having me, and thank you very much for speaking about this very, very important topic, and increasingly important topic, because the COVID crisis has actually worsened the situation. Because often when we speak about women's rights and women's rights and women's participation in society, there's the general impression that things are improving progressively. We just need to be patient, and things have been improving for some time. But this year, especially 2020, with the COVID crisis, we have seen things going backward. What is the gender employment gap? The gender employment gap is a series of things, and it basically consists in the fact that women usually don't have regular 40 or 45-year-long working careers. Women work all the time. There are very few women who don't work, but women do a lot of unpaid work as well. There is paid work in this world, and there's unpaid work, which is, for example, taking care of children or taking care of elderly or people with handicaps, which is doing household chores, washing, cleaning, buying food. This is all work that is absolutely necessary for people to be able to go to a work paid by their employer, or to manage their own company, for example. And these two kinds of work have exactly the same dignity, and they're both very important for society. And we have seen that especially in the COVID crisis, that the work of taking care of people, taking care of sick people, work that was done in hospitals, but also at home, but also providing food like supermarket cashiers, was extremely important. And that's usually female work. That is work done by women, or in a paid or an unpaid way. While men more often work with technology, with objects. This is obviously very, very generalized, and I don't want things to stay this way, but this is sort of the state of the situation now. Now, the difference is that women do 2/3 of the unpaid work. Both work the same. Actually, when you look at the stats that count unpaid and paid works, women work a couple of hours more per day than men. But 2/3 of their work is unpaid and 1/3 is paid. They do 2/3 of the total of unpaid work and one third of the paid work. And for men, it is vice versa. So 2/3 is paid and 1/3 is unpaid. And this is something we need to change. And this is true in every stage of life, but particularly in that stage of life where you usually have children. And that's worse. So women very often interrupt their careers when they have children, and then gradually come back. Some in Italy, many women drop out totally. In other countries, they tend to come back, but many of them then work part-time. And that means you don't make progress in your career, and your salary doesn't increase anymore, while men, this is obviously always very much generalizing, I have to say that, steadily progress. And that means that in the end of life, you don't only have a gender employment gap in the sense that women are less frequently employed in a stable way, but you have a gender pay gap because women get paid less. You have a gender pension gap because women don't have a steady career that continues every year, but they sort of drop in and out of the labor market because they do a lot of other unpaid work that needs to be done. And then we have that, so the gender employment gap in some countries, it varies quite a lot from country to country. Like in Italy, which is worst, the gender employment gap, so the women's participation on the labor market dropped during the COVID crisis to below 50%. So less than 1 out of 2 women have a paid job in Italy. In the Scandinavian countries, the difference is very little. In Germany, you have an interesting situation because 70% of the women participate in the labor market, but 66% of mothers work part-time compared to 6% of men. And this whole situation has worsened a lot last year.
Thank you very much, Ms. Geese. I think I'm a bit of echo. Well, I think all the data you gave are quite shocking, really, and worth think of it. And I really liked also that you stressed that unpaid work is as much valuable as paid work and key for our society, and the crisis has proven that, really. But let me take a bit of a cynical economic perspective for a second, because while I wrote my article, I came across this 2017 Eurofund report, which estimates that the economic loss due to the gender employment gap in the EU amounts to more than 370 billion per year. So, as you said, there is a lot of heterogeneity between different European countries, and the ones much worst are Malta, for example, where the percentage of gross domestic product lost every year amounts to 8.2%, Italy 5.7%, and Greece 5%, while on the other end of the spectrum, we have Sweden and Lithuania with losses lower than 1.5%. And so this, of course, depends from how wide is the gap in the employment and the labor market. And in 2019, so before the pandemic, in Italy was 19.6 percentage points. In my article, I focus mainly on the 6 major countries of the EU. So another country that is not doing very well is Romania. But also a country as Germany, that is often taken as an example by everyone else, has a quite noticeable employment gap of, the Eurostat estimates 8 percentage points. And when you think of what you just said, that in Italy at the moment only one woman out of 2 in working age is actually working in the labor market, it means that we are basically losing a quarter of the overall productive capacity of the country, which it's really worrying, and it's also on the optimistic side, means that there is a huge gap of huge margin of improvement, right? There is so much that can be done to improve the situation, and the benefits would be massive. So my follow-up questions would be, what can countries lagging behind do to close this gap? And could you give us some examples, if possible, of reforms that have worked and reforms that are not so good instead?
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. That is very timely because with NextGenerationEU, we actually have the possibility to invest in infrastructure and in new systems in order to change this. And this is something that really triggered me to start this campaign that I started that's called Half of It, to give half of the money of the recovery fund or NextGenerationEU to women, because that is also a way not only for a question of gender equality, but also to foster a sustainable growth in our economy. So that, I mean, you made the point how much growth potential is there. So I think the first thing, and this is what the Scandinavian countries teach us, is to invest in care, in public care, and especially in childcare. There is a study done in the UK by Sue Himmelweit and Jerome, can't remember his last name, but it's a very interesting study that shows that every million invested in childcare creates a lot more job than investing in the construction sector. And it always creates more job for everybody. It always creates more jobs for women, but also for men, which is, not intuitive. But this is a solid economic evidence. That shows it really makes sense to invest heavily in childcare, because investing in childcare means the mothers don't stay home; they can go work elsewhere, and a lot of people get employed in working in those services. In the long term, childcare pays for itself, because there are a lot of studies. There's, for example, the Nobel Prize winner Thomas Heckmann, who did work on this. That's really remarkable. That shows that children who have been in high quality in childcare, I mean, it must be decent quality, but for example, in many European countries, you have very good childcare facilities, Scandinavian countries, Italy. We know how to do high quality childcare, early childcare, and that those children are later healthier physically and psychologically. They're more productive, they have higher income, they have higher degrees of education. So it's absolutely a win-win situation. And therefore, at a certain point, they're more productive, they pay more taxes. The problem is that there is a slight time delay in this case, but it's a long-term investment that is really important for every society. At the same time, what you need, there is you need to invest in all kinds of care facilities, also for the elderly, because we know that in many countries we are not really able to provide for our elderly people without importing cheap labor from abroad. This is basically what we do. We call poor women from other countries. For example, you mentioned Romania before, a lot of people, very highly qualified people often. We have engineers from Romania taking care of elderly people in Italy or in Germany. We have Polish teachers taking care of our elderly in Germany as well. Also women from other poorer countries. And this is not sustainable in the long run, neither for the European Union nor for the world. It doesn't make sense simply. So we need to create public systems. In order to finance that, we need to tax big companies that are not paying enough taxes. So that's one point. Another very important point is to get a better gender mix in economic sectors. Now we have some kind of gender segregation on the labor market. That is what I explained before. So the women work in jobs where you work with people, basically, childcare, education, health system, all psychology, all these kinds of things where you work with people, retail. And men work in technology, which leads to women's jobs getting paid worse and worse. Teacher once, at least in Germany, was a very highly well-paying job. Now the prestige is going down, the pay is going down. This is something when a lot of women move into a profession, usually the renommee of that profession and the salaries start going down. While in the technology sector, and we don't have enough people to do that, like in the care sector, we don't find enough people to do that work, and we have to import them from abroad because the wages are just not sustainable. The same problem we have in the technology sectors where the wages are good, like for example in IT, but we don't find enough people to work there. We have a lack of talent. We don't have a lack of money to invest in the IT sector. We have a lack of talent, of people who want to work there, because there's the stereotype of the nerd, the person who doesn't have social, capabilities, doesn't talk to anybody. They're all male. There are almost no women in IT. Europe-wide, 17%. And a lot of women who study in computer science later drop out because there's usually a very sexist attitude in the companies. So the first thing we have to do is to sort of mix these sectors. That doesn't only mean to encourage girls to study STEM subjects, which is usually the only answer. It also means starting to pay care jobs better in order to encourage men to work in care, to work with people. And it means opening up, especially in IT, the digital field, which I have studied most, which I know best. There are a lot of things you can do in order to work in the IT sector without having a degree in computer science. So you can take on people who have a different kind of background and bravely train them in order to learn a programming language, for example, or to understand the processes and to work either in programming or in some other role within an IT company, because IT companies also need sociologists, for example, need people with very different kinds of backgrounds. So something we could do, for example, to use the RF, the Recovery and Resilience Facility, and the money that comes with it, is to fund, especially to give it to companies who are prepared to come up with a plan on how to increase diversity within their company. Because many of the people who are losing their jobs, especially the women in Italy or in Spain, will not go back to work in the same sector because these jobs are gone. Like in the retail sector, when you shift from buying offline, which often means small retail stores in the center of the city or of your village, and these stores are closing down because of the pandemic, and people start getting their deliveries online and buying online. That means that often before in the retail jobs, you had women working there, the typical person serving in a retail store, especially in a small store, or owning her own store are usually women very often, though the share of women is very high there. When this goes to IT companies, online shopping, let's say Amazon, just to mention one, by chance, that is logistics, warehouses, they're men working, and it's IT, and it's men again. So that woman who lost her job, she won't find another job in a store. This is a shift from female to male. And there's very little in the regulation accompanying the recovery and resilience facilities making sure that happens. So the national governments have to make sure that happens and then have to come up with plans. And there are great projects. There's Rosanna Kura, for example, who has a company in Luxembourg who trains cybersecurity experts. And she says these great things. She says, well, the lack of women in the IT industry, especially in cybersecurity, is a threat. It's a security threat to Europe because we need a lot more people to work in that sector. And it's easy to train a person in a year to work there with very different backgrounds. So she's training adult women to work in that sector. And in order to make that possible, you have to do it in a way that's, for example, family friendly. So have trainings online, offline, in a mixed way. I mean, everybody's doing that anyway, but she did it before COVID set in. Do it in a family friendly way. Provide childcare, for example. Make sure it's not a 9 to 7 job, but it is decently sliced in order for people with families, for example. I mean, there are lots of great projects to do that. And this is what we need to do, to mix up the sectors and to train people in unconventional ways.
Thank you very much, Ms. Geese. I think you throw a lot in there. There is a lot of food for thought. And just maybe to try to sum up and give a bit of an outlook and try to sum your thoughts. One figure that I was particularly shocked about reading the EU Women's Digital Manifesto, that maybe later you can tell us a bit more about, was the one you mentioned, that only 17% of information and communication technology specialists are women, and only 34% of STEM graduates are women. For those of you who don't know, STEM stands for science, technology, engineering, and math. And another figure that was particularly shocking for me is that in 2019, out of every $100 invested in European tech companies, 92 went to found teams that were all men, which is a lot. And I like that you mentioned education, childcare facilities, and involving women in innovation. So, in terms of childcare, are we thinking more of kindergartens? Are we thinking of providing vouchers, for example, as they did in France for babysitting at home? Um, do we want to implement all the tools available? And in terms of education, let me just add that it's not just at the beginning, but also at the very end. In my article, I found that um, women with tertiary education, so with high education levels, university education, were the ones with the highest rate of employment. And you could really see the step changes when you moved from primary education to secondary education and tertiary education. And this is a figure common to all countries. And is particularly relevant, I believe, also because women are more likely to end the highest level of education. So once enrolled at university, women are more likely to finish it than men. And finally, about the women in ICT and in startups, incubators, how can we foster that change? You mentioned that a couple of projects that are trying to do that, but on a more systemic way, what can be done?
Well, that was a long question.
Sorry.
I think one, but you mentioned all the important things. I think one, when we think about tech, for example, where a lot of innovation happens, and where you have the problem that sort of traditional stereotypes from the traditional financing and banking system that already discriminates a lot against women, meets modern stereotype from the tech sector. And this is how you come up with this figure of 92% of the money going to all male teams, which is totally crazy. So there's a host of things we could do. First of all, to encourage women angel investors to come in more strongly, to create networks, for example, to create some kind of public support, to lower the money that the founder has to bring in order to start a company. Wants to start up a company, has to bring some money, and often women don't have that money. I mean, the large part of the wealth of this world lies in men's hands, and women usually don't have that much money. So helping women not to have to come up with 10,000 euros, but rather only 5,000 before doing the first funding round or something would help. And their public support could very strongly help. So we should have public venture capital funds, which is something we should have anyway to foster innovation in Europe. And we should earmark part of the money for all female teams and part of the money for diverse teams. This is something that makes sense. I mean, today we have this situation that, for example, in the European Union, under the Horizon programs, diverse teams, mixed teams get funding over all female teams, which, you know, from a very abstract point of view makes sense that you say you want a diverse team. But when you know that only 6% of the people financed are females, that's crazy. You should have some all female teams out there. And that also makes sense from an economic point of view, because it's known that companies that are more diverse are more productive. They have higher revenue. They work better. They have a better management culture with their staff. And what is also interesting, what I've been discovering, what is important for me as a green politician, they're more sustainable, like they decrease their CO2 emissions quicker if there are more women on the board, which is absolutely is not an obvious connection, but it's also, it's absolutely true. It's particularly important in tech, like in the energy sector, we have a very similar situation. I focus on tech because tech is where people take decisions that shape our lives now and in the future, the way social networks work, the way communication systems works, the way recruiting works, which is increasingly based on artificial intelligence. Credit scoring is increasingly based on artificial intelligence. That is all absolutely decisive for how our societies work. And for example, in artificial intelligence, the share of women is 14%, which means that 86% of the people working there and taking the decisions are men. And we know that if you are, well, women are not a minority, but if you end up being in a minority, in order to have a critical mass to really change the culture and to really influence decisions, you have to arrive at 40%, 40. So just having 1 or 2 women in teams of 8 or 7 men doesn't work. It doesn't make a difference. There's no impact. So we really have to make sure these teams are diverse in order to create a world that works for everybody. How do you do that? I think there are very many. I mentioned some of what concerns of the measures that concerns financing. What is also interesting is the education aspects. For example, many women who have a strong career in tech have studied at same-sex universities, which is more an American thing. We usually don't do that in Europe. But one idea I like would be to have the elite university in computer science, females only, or to have special courses only for women, which is something I wouldn't, promote in a general way, but it's just a measure of emergency, I think, in this case. Then it depends a little bit on the countries. You asked a question on childcare. What kind of childcare? Well, it depends on the culture of the country and on the needs. Maybe in big cities, you need different solutions than in small villages. I'm very much in favor of high quality, really, kindergartens. But I also had a program. I ran a program where my daughter was little and I desperately needed childcare as a working mom. We had this project. We put 3 kids together and then a trained educator who came to stay with them in one of the houses of one of the 3 families. So it was a very cozy kind of setting that works, for other families, for other parents, and also for other children who might feel a little bit lost in a group of 10 children, but who are perfectly fine with one. So I think it depends really on the needs. The offer should be diverse. And the same thing is true for measures on education, university education, schools. Every school system is different in every European country. I come from a country where we have 16 different school systems, but because every land has its own and is very jealous of keeping this autonomy. One thing that is important, if you have computer science, you teach computer science at school, it shouldn't be an optional matter, because if it's optional, it's immediately a boys thing, and the boys go there and the girls who are interested sort of get this feeling, well, it's a boys thing, so as a girl, I'm not supposed to go. And this message can be very explicit, and this happens, all the women tell me, I always heard that I wasn't supposed to be there. But it can also be implicit, because the stereotypes in our society are so strong. And this really starts when kids are a year old, a year and a half. If you look at the toys children are given when they're 2 or 3 years old, the stereotyping is so strong that it's obvious that when they're 11 or 12, they know what they're supposed to choose. So computer science should always be mandatory for all children of all sexes. That's important. Something that would be work in what I was told works in Italy, for example, is not having university fees in STEM subjects for women. So you don't have to pay. And this is something that gets interesting for girls with poorer backgrounds. And it's interesting to notice that this happens in poorer countries. For example, a high share of women informatic engineers you find in Iran and in Turkey. And it's the poor families who send the girls to study those subject matters, because they know those are jobs that are going to pay, they're going to pay back the families with the money they're going to make. So that might work in some countries. In my countries, for example, what would work is having very high standards in terms of grade for entry, because in my country, girls graduate from high school with better grades, but then choose humanities at university. So then they study languages and all those things that don't pay well later, while the boys have worse grades, but study technical matters and in the end make a lot of money. And if you, in every university course where the entry requirements are very high in terms of grades, of school grades, the share of girls increases. That's happened in medicine, where you have to 10 points out of 10. You have to have really the highest grade when you graduate from high school. And now the entry level, the share of women at the entry level is 60% in medicine. And Germans are discussing, oh, wait, maybe they're too high and we should do something about this. Or very often in the judicial system, you have very objective entry criteria. And in many countries now, it's almost female only, the young people entering those systems, the judicial system. I know that this is true for Italy, and it's happening in a lot of German courts as well, because the men often don't have the grades. So setting very high standards for those professions, for IT, for example, might help to get more women in there. Or have mandatory only 50% men and 50% women. Have quotas help really a lot, because a woman who walks into a room and there are 2 girls and 98 boys, going to be difficult. There's so many hurdles you have to get over. Just make it easier.
Yeah. Thank you very much. That was a long answer as well, very, very tough. So thank you for that. I think you touched a lot of different points, all very, very important and quite interesting. I liked a lot the idea of linking the Horizon program. And for those of you who don't know it, Horizon is the major research and development program of the EU. So a lot of funds go through the Horizon program to gender equality issues and women participation in research. I think we have a few questions, if I'm not wrong. So one is, you can read it.
Yeah, I'm reading the question. Yeah, that's great. Great question. The reduction of gender employment gap and towards sustainability, there absolutely is a link, because, as I said before, for example, companies that have more women on the board are more sustainable. Because I don't know why this happens, but it seems that women generally make more sustainable choices in an ecological sense, but also in a social sense. I don't know whether this is why we are more educated to care about everybody else rather than to focus on our own success. But this really happens in companies as well. If you get women in the companies, this happens. Another one is if you have more women, for example, working in technical departments, for example, those urban planning, mobility, and so on. This also changes because women use public transport use mobility differently. They use cars less and use more public transport. So if you put them in charge of planning those services, they will make different choices. That's very interesting. So there definitely are quite a lot of advantages. Another one in social sense is, if I may, I'm sorry.
Absolutely, yes, please, go ahead.
Speaking about children, I mean, the point is not getting everybody work out of the house and leave the children only in professional care. A very interesting measure that has been taken in Spain is to have paternity and maternity leaves of the same duration. So the mother stays at home for 4 months and the father stays at home 4 months. So the child can stay at home with both parents being paid, but 4 months with the mother and 4 months with the father. And there's a lot of research that says that fathers who stay at home in the first months of their child, and not just a week or 10 days, but really several months and on their own with the child without the mother, are better fathers because they stay at home more when the child is older, but children get sick and they are out of school all the time. They stay at home when the children are sick. don't only have fun on Sundays with their children, but they really care for them. They really listen to them. They spend a lot of more time during the week also with the children, and the children are better. That children who spend more time with both parents are in better mental health later. So this has an impact for a very long time. There was another point on sustainability that I wanted to make, and make it later.
I very much like your comment there, Ms. Geese. I think gender equality is really a two-way street. It's not just about women's rights per se, but is also changing a bit the cultural stereotype, and therefore giving more paternal leave to fathers helps also fighting a stereotype that we have entrenched into culture, really, especially in the Mediterranean countries in the south. Do we want to go with the second question? I saw they're popping up.
The language. Oh, absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And this comes from Italy. This question, I know there was this discussion about the direttore, direttrice. Yeah, it absolutely does, because language is not neutral. Language creates images in our heads, and language is an instrument of power as well. I maybe that's the person who asked the question was referring to this Italian discussion where when you say you're a director, for example, you have to say it in a male or in a female way. In English, it's great because we have these neutral professions. In many other languages, you have to specify whether you're a female or a male director or a female or a male teacher or whatever. You always have to specify. And there's some languages, almost all languages, male professions had the male name, and it was quite unusual when women started entering those professions to use the female version, because it sounds less powerful, less right, less, you're not really, it's like a diminutive, smaller version of the same thing. So there's discussion about women, whether to use the male or the female form. And I'm lucky because I come from a country where we had a female chancellor for 16 years. And when she first started out, there was a big discussion whether she was supposed to call chancellor with the male or the female version. And then everybody, at a certain point, she opted for the female version. Everybody used to it. And now it's sort of strange of thinking, we have election coming up in September, and we might have a male chancellor, and the whole country is like, well, how is it? Because we're so used to using the female version of it. Language is very important. And there's one important point that I'm very passionate about, to come back on the issue that women are so important in artificial intelligence and in the tech sector, also for that reason, because we use a lot of automated translation, which is absolutely great, because I'm pretty good on languages, but there's still so many languages I don't understand. And we're also happy to be able to read documents from other languages being translated by automated translation systems. They have the problem that they're hugely influenced by stereotypes. And I had a text today that somebody sent me from a Google translation from Hungarian. Just give me a second, because it's so impressive. Because automated translation totally reproduces stereotypes, and this is really proven. There's research on this, that this happens. And this is the text. I'm reading this text, and Hungarian only has one pronoun, and no female and male pronouns, just one neutral pronoun for saying he and she. And this is a text that was translated from Hungarian, always with the same pronoun. Listen to it in English. She is beautiful. He is clever. He understands math. She's kind. He's a doctor. She's a cleaner. He's a politician. She's a teacher. He is strong. He's clever. He's a driver. She's shopping. She washes the dishes. He's a doctor. He's fishing. He makes a lot of money, and so on. And this is exactly what you have in your head. It's the stereotypes, and this leads people in a company to choose a man over a woman when they want a computer science expert, and a woman when they want a nurse or somebody to wash the dishes, and so on. And the worst thing is that artificial algorithms that are used for recruiting, for credit scoring, use this kind of information. They're trained with this data, and they read this data. And this is why it's so important to change the language, to use the female words also for the professions that used to be male, also for power positions, to really, as women, use female terms. It's absolutely important.
That's a great insight, really. I know, like in your past career, you were an interpreter, if I'm not wrong. So yeah, that was really good. Thank you. If you don't mind, we would have a couple of last questions, and then we can come to a close. So
the gender compared. Not sure. As I said, I think it's public might be. I don't have the numbers. But the question is there any difference regarding the gender employment gap in the public sector compared to the private sector? I don't have any numbers. I'm not quite sure about this. Usually, from what I know, there are a lot more women working in the public sector because you usually have more standard working hours. So therefore, it's more compatible with having a family if you're a woman, when you're supposed to, pick up your kids from school on time and not 2 hours later, because the director asked for a meeting at 5 p.m.
I think there is also a cultural prejudice there, right? Because most of the teachers, which is public sector in most countries, are female, and nurses as well. You told us about doctors now, so I think healthcare and the education sector are female prevalent, but I don't have the stats either.
But for example, things like urban planning, all the technical jobs, you still have a lot of men also in the public sector. I think more women than in the private sector. The mixture is a little bit better, but I don't know, would have to look at country by country. I'm not sure. So I think it's a little better, but it doesn't mean much actually. Yeah. And then salaries usually in the public sector worse than in the private sector. So there's a reason for it. There might be a connection, I'm afraid.
Do we have a final question here? Yes.
The committee of the EP, not specific on the gender employment gap. There's the FEM committee, the Committee for Women's Rights, that obviously deals with these issues and all the issues connected with gender equality very clearly. But what I think is that we deal with that in all other committees. And my experience was from this year and the last year actually, that it's important really to go into the economic committees, because it's really in economics that you need more women, that all people who decide are men. So we have, if we look at the average, we have a decent representation of women in the European Parliament. It's 40%, which is better than most national parliaments. And you really feel it, that it's different to work that way. But if it comes down to the economic committees, the women are basically gone. 23 out of 27 ministers, European ministers for economic affairs, are men. That's a share of males of 85%. And this explains quite a lot about why the decisions that were taken on NextGenerationEU, if I may speak about this, because it's really my big topic. NextGenerationEU is the big fiscal stimulus program of the European Union in order to relaunch the European economy after COVID, if COVID ever passes, we hope so. The problem with it is that 20% of the money, which is a lot, 750 billion, this is a lot of money if you can just invest it, especially to the southern European countries who get the bulk of it. 20% go to the digital sector, which is fine because I do digital affairs mainly. It's great idea. 37% go to the green transition, which is also a great idea because I'm a green politician, and the biggest crisis we have is still the climate crisis, so great stuff. But that means 47% of this money go to 4 sectors, because green means renewable energy, construction, and transport. Plus, then there's 20% digital, so 57 in total. Don't get lost with the numbers. Where the share of female employment is below 20%. Below 20%, less than 1 out of 5 people working there is the woman. Why? We are facing an economic crisis where we have the data from Italy. 70% of the people who had to drop out of the labor market are women. And this is totally crazy. And this can only happen if the people who decide don't see the women in the labor market. And this means we are not really focusing on growth. Because you gave the numbers before, the easiest way to grow an economy is to increase the employment of women and to have a balance between the different sectors. That's the easiest thing to do, especially if you want to grow an economy in a sustainable way, because it doesn't make sense. We are facing the climate crisis, and to invest only in construction and in railways, yes, in motorways doesn't absolutely make sense. So we have to invest in a very smart way anyway. And the smartest way would have been to involve the women and to have a 50% share of the women in the way that I explained at the beginning: childcare, mixing the gender mix in the sectors and so on.
And this is why you were the first signatory and the proposals of half of it. If I remember correctly, basically you were proposing just that, right? So increase the share of EU funds in the recovery plan, apart from those of climate change that already have written down that need to keep an eye on gender equality issues, to 50%, including therefore the digital part of the package, which at the moment doesn't have this clause, let's say, into it. And I think after the numbers we covered tonight, that's very, very important, especially given that we are going toward a digital age where most of jobs will be digital and will need digital skills.
Totally. And where the gender gap is going to increase, if you just focus on digital and those sectors, it's going to get worse, not better, if we don't correct it. We can do great things to correct it, I think. And we will all live in a better society if we get a better mix and close the gender employment gap and the gender pay gap. But if we just let it go, it's not going to improve because of what is happening in the labor market: automation, digitalization, that regards a lot of women's jobs. There's not perfect consensus among scientists, but a lot of them are saying it's mainly the female jobs in the middle segment that are very, very strongly impacted. People working for insurances, telecommunications, like white collar, decently paid jobs where a lot of women work, routine jobs. Those will be very, very heavily impacted. And what will be left is the high-tech jobs where the men work right now, which are really high paying, and the care jobs. We will still need a lot of labor. We will not run out of labor. That's not the problem. But it will be a lot of work for people, children, elderly. Our societies are getting older and older. We will have so many people over 80 that somebody needs to take care of. But if we don't decide to pay these people decently and train these people decently, the future for all of us as a society, but especially for women, will be very bleak. So we should invest in this now. We have all these greatly qualified women. And one thing that's very important to me, it's not about fixing the women, because often if you talk about you need to have more women in STEM and more women in IT, it's about, well, we have to teach the girls. I mean, women are better educated in every single sector. Women have better grades. Women work more. Women are really achieve a lot because they know, not because they're more intelligent, but because they know they have to, because they will only succeed if they work a lot more than men, and they do. So it's not about fixing the women. It's about fixing the structures that keep us all from succeeding. The women on the labor market and in terms of pay and income and safety, because having an income means you're safe against domestic violence, for example. You're a lot safer against sexual violence because you can just walk out because you have your own income, you can get your own apartment, you solve a lot of problems. And it's better for men too, because also men who have time to take care of their children, to spend time with their families, for their friends, who don't always have to succeed and make a lot of money because they have to provide for a family. They have a better life too. It's better for all of us.
On this positive note, I think we can draw it to a conclusion. It was such a pleasure to have you here, Ms. Geese. I really enjoyed the live, and I think we touch a lot of important points, and we also, I think you gave a really positive message. Therefore, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
While Ms. Geese leaves us, let me just mention the article that you can find on jeuneeurope.com. It's called The Gender Employment Gap. And there you can find a lot of data, digging a bit deeper inside the issue. And let me also thank very much Livia, Laura, and Davide, who helped me translate the article in French and in German. If you don't know about Jeune Europe, as I said at the beginning, we are a community of young people from a bit all over Europe who are trying to share their knowledge and their expertise with everyone else. And we're trying to do that in multiple languages in order to increase the accessibility of the articles we write and the content we create. So as you can see in the banner, follow us on www.jeuneeurope.com. Thank you very much, and have a good evening. Bye.